one of the focuses of the summit you attended was the AUKUS agreement. There are a lot of questions emerging about that, including whether at the end of the day the US will have the capacity and the will to deliver the Virginia-class submarines that they're supposedly committed to doing, the capacity of the UK to supply the ones subsequently, and our capacity to do what we need to do in Australia, including operating those submarines. And there also seem to be at least some questions around what the AUKUS treaty ultimately commits Australia to do in various hypothetical scenarios. Perhaps it would be good to hear your views, Rowan, about some of those issues, with the uncertainty that now exists around the trustworthiness and reliability of the US under Donald Trump and perhaps under those who might succeed him. Do we need to be rethinking the commitments we've entered into under AUKUS?
I would say that the current set of circumstances have nothing to do with Donald Trump. The current set of circumstances exist whether he is the president or not, and that is the capacity and ability of the United States to deliver the first of our nuclear submarine capabilities, which are American submarines built by America. The second thing that's important, I think, that people understand about AUKUS is that it's about a lot more than just nuclear submarines. We hear talk of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is the provision of nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines to Australia, in the first instance from the United States, and then later from the United Kingdom. And at some point, there is embedded in that building in Australia. But there are other aspects to Pillar 1 that are very relevant as well, and those are things like the establishment of a maintenance capability at Australia's expense in our submarine base in Western Australia, a maintenance capability capable of looking after Virginia-class submarines, and whether they're ours or America's, whether they visit or not. So it's essentially a forward operating base for US and UK nuclear-powered submarines. That's of significant importance because it is quite a shift in Australia's posture, and it's seen in the context of what's referred to as the Force Posture Agreement, which has seen us go from 500 or so Marines rotating through Darwin to something like 2,500 Marines today based there semi-permanently, and infrastructure being built at the Air Force Base at Tyndall to take nuclear-capable B-52 bombers, that sort of thing. So there's major shifts. Not all of that's AUKUS. The submarine base in Western Australia is part of AUKUS. It is part of Pillar 1, and Pillar 2 covers technology exchange over 5 areas such as hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, and several other things. Those are things that probably all could have and probably would have and may already have been part of the engagement between Australia and the UK and the US anyway, and may not have needed AUKUS to exist at all. So the singular focus that I would want people to take in respect of these discussions is around the nuclear-powered submarines, not all the other bits and pieces that are under the banner of AUKUS. And those circumstances exist regardless of Mr. Trump. Right. Mr. Trump might have an opinion, he might have an impact, he might do things that we might look at and say this makes life difficult, whatever, but we don't know. We don't know what he's going to do. And the circumstances that have led to Malcolm Turnbull having his forum actually don't have anything to do with Donald Trump. They have mostly to do with the ability of the UK and the US to deliver the submarine capability of our future.
Right. Now, can we just drill into that a little bit more? I'm not sure I understand all of it, but I think the US is currently producing 1.5 submarines a year or something like that, and that people have said that for the US to feel sufficiently secure about its own submarine capability to be willing to deliver the first and then 2 more Virginia-class submarines to us, that they need to be building 2.5 or 3 submarines a year. And we are giving them foreign aid, in effect, to assist them building up that capability. Is there a significant risk that by the time we're meant to take delivery of our first submarine, that capability on the US's part won't have been attained?
There is a very major risk. In fact, some would assert an absolute certainty that the US will not be in a position to hand over Virginia-class submarines to Australia. There's a little wrinkle in this that I think is worth just being aware of, and it goes to the question of how the AUKUS Pact came into existence in the first place. And as Malcolm Turnbull pointed out, it came into existence in absolute secrecy. There were no cabinet processes that examined it. There was no public debate about it. It was if you like, a captain's call by Prime Minister Morrison, where he announced quite out of the blue, that is not to say that no work had been done, work had been done, but quite out of the blue, he announced the dumping of the French contract for our future conventional submarines, and I would observe did that in a way which did substantial damage to our relationship with France that was unnecessary, and we don't know why he did that. We do know that at the time we were on the verge of signing a construction contract, and yes, there'd been difficulties with the relationship and getting to a construction contract, and there probably would have continued to be some difficulties in various ways, but it would appear that at the time that Prime Minister Morrison made the announcement, things were going okay with the French. So why was it dumped? And the statements at the time of it would be obsolete before it hit the water and that we really needed to go nuclear. Well, there was no debate about that. There was no justification of it. Personally, just our geography is such that a nuclear-powered submarine for Australia has always been and will always be more operationally useful. And that's one of the reasons why, over the course of probably 30 years as a minimum, we have consistently and repeatedly, at least 6 times, asked the United States if they would give us access to nuclear-powered submarines, and on every occasion we've been refused up until this time. So what's changed this time, and what has been agreed to? What has Australia agreed to do in return for the Americans deciding for the first time since the 1950s to transfer nuclear submarine propulsion technology on the one hand, and submarines, which they've never sold to anybody. They have provided a submarine nuclear reactor back in the early days to Great Britain, but they've given it to no one else. So what have we signed up to that we don't know about? Because we know that surrounding the pact is a great deal of secrecy, and there have been government statements to the effect that we have agreed to some secret but not binding political agreements around the submarine. So that's the first thing I think is really important. There is so much in this that we just don't know.
You've obviously been on the other side of these negotiations and arrangements with our allies, and understandably there are things that need to be kept secret so that our potential adversaries don't find out things that we don't want them to know. But does the secrecy you're speaking about here go beyond those traditional concerns?
Well, I think the indications that we've been given by government suggest that the answer is yes to that. Now, you're quite right, of course, there are many details in the exchange of technology between countries, especially very sensitive technology like submarines and all of the associated very high-tech, very sophisticated stuff that is associated with them. We would, of course, want to keep that confidential. We're obliged to because of security classification of the information and the agreement for non-disclosure that exists between countries. There's nothing unusual about that. That's quite normal, and it exists commercially as well. We don't do business with another company much in Australia before we have a non-disclosure agreement in place to make sure that the information we exchange, which might be proprietary, is actually protected by the other side. So there's nothing unusual about that. The piece of this that I think is very unusual and that does concern me is that we have been told that the government has signed up to political agreement which is not binding. What does that actually mean? We've promised the American administration something or some things which the government is not willing to declare publicly, and so we're left to speculate. What have we handed over here? Is it actually more than access to port facilities and maintenance facilities for which we're going to pay here in Australia, in Western Australia, which, as Gareth Evans said, becomes, if we get into a conflict with anyone, especially a nuclear-armed power, it becomes a nuclear target.
Right, and we're talking about the city of Perth. There are more than 2 million people here. Yes.
Well, that's right. And previously others say, and both he and Kim Beazley and others have said, Pine Gap makes us a nuclear target. Well, that's true. So that's Alice Springs. Well, now we're talking about a major capital, but there's also Tyndall and so on. So is there anything else we've agreed to? Like, for example, have we agreed, and this bit becomes really quite important, especially when you confront the difficulties that you touched on, which I'll go into in a little more detail. This becomes really important if the American industrial base is not in a healthy state to provide our submarines. Have we perhaps agreed that if they hand over the submarines and we either man them fully, man them partially, jointly with the US, or whatever the arrangement is, even if they're flying an Australian flag, have we suggested a commitment by some future government at some point that these submarines will be made available to the United States in a war against someone else who might be a nuclear power? And let's face it, that's China. That's what we face mostly these days. So I think this whole secrecy around what have we actually agreed to do is very troubling. And that goes to the heart of one of the key questions being raised on Monday by Malcolm Turnbull is about our sovereignty. Is it a sovereign decision of ours anymore to go to war with China, or have we already committed to that? Now, we've heard politicians like Peter Dutton say it is inconceivable that we would not. But we've also seen polls very recently that say that in excess of 50% of Australians, of those polled, of both sides of political persuasion, are not in favour of going to war with China, especially not in favour over Taiwan. So this is a complex question here that lies at the foundation, veiled in secrecy, of the birth of AUKUS in the first place, stressing that I'm talking about now the SSNs, the nuclear-powered submarines.
And this secrecy is presumably bipartisan. I mean, as I understand it, the Labor Party, when they were in opposition, were given less than 24 hours notice of the AUKUS agreement. They agreed to it immediately, presumably without having the time to absorb and think about what they were signing up to. And the secrecy which you describe around the AUKUS agreement has been maintained by the Albanese Labor government.
That's true. And not only, as I understand it, not only was there that very short space of time, 24 hours no more, but they were told very little. The Albanese opposition at the time was given very little information. And of course, we know too that the French were given no warning at all. That's a very sharp comment by President Macron. I don't think, I know.
I know. Yes, yes. So one of the things that came up there at the summit you attended, as I gather from press reports, is whether Australia now needs to be thinking about a so-called Plan B. You know, what do we do if the early 2030s the US is unwilling to hand over the submarines to us that they've committed to, or will only hand them over under terms that the government at the time deems unacceptable? What, if anything, should we be thinking about or doing now to cover that contingency?
Well, I think the first thing that our government really should do is be examining the current set of circumstances that are evident in the United States industrial arrangements. That is the first one to supply us with nuclear-powered submarines. And the reason that is a time-critical activity, in my view, is simply because our own existing Collins-class submarines are approaching the end of their original design life. In fact, the oldest of those submarines, the first one, HMAS Collins, would under normal circumstances have been due to retire probably this year. And now various things have happened there, and that's not the case. She's spent a lot of time out of service. But this requirement to extend the Collins-class submarines to bridge the gap between them reaching the end of their life about now through to the beginning of arrival of the Virginias in the first instance, that's become quite critical. Now, on that I would say, well, it's been known since 2011, and I can be precise about that because I briefed the senior committees personally as the head of the submarine program in 2011, that in 2011 we had no choice but to extend the life of all 6 Collins-class submarines. We had to do it then, just because things are going to take so long. Now, that was 2011. Today is 2025. 14 years later, we've done nothing. We have not taken any steps to start work extending the existing Collins-class submarines. So we are on the cusp of the impending decline of our existing submarine capability. That's the first thing. The second thing is, quite apart from the urgency with which we need to resolve this problem, the industrial circumstances in the United States and you touched on it, such that we can have no confidence that an American administration in 2031, when it's required to confirm to Congress under law that America's own capabilities will not be diminished by transferring a submarine and then a subsequent extra 2 or 4 to a total of 5 to Australia. That's not going to affect America's own undersea warfare capabilities. Now, let's just look at that for a minute. The US Navy says that to meet all of its obligations that are imposed on it by the administration and the Congress, it has a requirement for 66 nuclear attack submarines. Today, it has 49. Of those, a significant proportion are ageing Los Angeles-class submarines, some of which will be refueled to extend their lives, some of which will be retired depending on their circumstances. So they've got a significant ageing problem, and they are flat out trying to replace the Los Angeles class with the new Virginia class. Now, the new Virginia class, they have been delivering at a rate of about 1.2 submarines a year for the last 5 years. And they've been struggling to grow the capacity to deliver more submarines more quickly. But they have also gone from a time when each Virginia class took about 60 months, that's 5 years, to build. The submarine has been extended and grown, and that means that more man-hours are required to build each one. So that period of time has extended out quite significantly for that reason, plus the fact that their own capacity and productivity and workforce has shrunk. And that's all as a consequence of a recruiting freeze imposed in the shipbuilders going right back to the end of the Cold War. These shortage bubbles that take a generation to move through the labour force. Right. You can't just wave a magic wand and invent people who are sufficiently experienced and skilled to build submarines. So they're confronting major labour problems in certainly in Electric Boat, which is the principal submarine builder, although they also have Newport News that builds their submarines too. So they have significant industrial capacity problems, such that they have not been able to get above 1.2 submarines a year delivered to the United States Navy in the last 5 years. And there's no reason that anyone should have confidence that they will, even if they manage to increase their capacity to deliver more than 1.2 submarines a year. The target must be 2.33 submarines per year if they are going to be in a position to meet their own requirements, let alone transferring submarines to Australia. So the foreign aid that we're providing, just a comment about that, the first down payment by Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Miles recently to America of $500 million US, that is a drop in the bucket of the amount of money necessary, even if the people existed, even if the national industrial capacity in the United States existed to get to 2.33. So the deduction, the analysis that's been made of that industry is that it's not unreasonable to suggest that it's simply not possible for America to get to where it needs to be to start transferring to us. And this is before we even start talking about the United Kingdom, which is in a much worse state.
Indeed. So do we seriously need to be thinking about talking to other countries with the capacity to produce submarines about, if not replacing the submarines we're meant to be getting under AUKUS, at least having some kind of contingency for the possibility that we won't get them? I mean, is that doable? And if it is, what do we need to be doing in the next 12 months?
Yeah. So I think that set of circumstances that's pretty clear, it's pretty stark, and this is information that's being handed out publicly to anyone who cares to read it by the Congressional Budget Office and the Congressional Research Service. So this is very experienced analysts and researchers in both budget and submarine matters. The principal researcher for the Congressional Research Service has been doing it on submarines for about 40 years. He knows what he's talking about, and he knows the US set of circumstances very well. So the information that we have and others who are saying, yes, we should go and look at something else, because this is not looking very healthy at all, is soundly based. It's probably as soundly based as you could find in any set of circumstances. It's hard to conceive of a better source of information about all of this than the United States itself. And note too that if you want to know what Australia's up to on almost any subject, go and look at an American website, because they're quite open about what's going on, whereas we are intensely secretive. So